Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. And I'm so excited to share Lisa Nerenberg with all of my audience. Lisa has a master's in social work, a master's in public health, and I've been a fan of her work for many years. She's the founding executive director of the California Elder Justice Coalition, which is elderjusticecal.org, if I'm remembering correctly, Lisa. And you now serve as the organization's director of special projects. You're also the co-founder of the San Francisco Consortium for Elder Abuse Prevention and the National Network of State Elder Justice Coalitions. Lisa has presented hundreds of times at professional forums, testified before state and federal legislative committees, served on multiple advisory boards and councils, written extensively about elder abuse, undue influence, and related topics. And I have one of your books here, Critical Topics in Our Aging Society, Elder Justice, Ageism, and Elder Abuse, and which is a roadmap for promoting individual rights and social justice in aging policy and programs, and elder abuse prevention, emerging trends and promising strategies, which describes what agencies, communities, states, tribes, and national organizations can do to prevent abuse and treat their effects and ensure justice. Lastly, you've served as a consultant to the San Francisco Superior Court on multiple studies exploring undue influence, and you're currently overseeing a study of conservatorship, the state's term for adult guardianships in California. This is my work. I love what you're doing, and I'm 70, so I'm elderly, but, for me, I can't come to this from the cult side of things, but we really have known for a long time when people age, especially if they experience dementia or Alzheimer's, they can really be taken advantage of horribly and isolated from family and friends and all of their assets. So can we start by I'd love for you to share, how did you get interested in this particular topic? And then we can go from there, because there's so many interesting things to talk about.
Well, you've already provided a lot of my background. Clearly, I've been in the field of elder abuse prevention for going on 40 years. When I started, I was talking about them, those old people, and now I've hit 70 also. So we're talking about it in a little bit of a different way now.
Yes.
But yeah, I got into the area of undue influence through my work in elder abuse prevention, because we were finding oftentimes in situations of financial abuse and neglect and emotional abuse that there was indications of undue influence. And you mentioned, or we've talked earlier about my colleague Mary Joy Quinn, who was with the San Francisco Superior Court. And when I was working in San Francisco, one of my tasks or responsibilities was to host a multidisciplinary team, which is where groups of professionals come together, talk about a case. And often we get these cases involving somebody not just with cognitive impairments, but who also just seem to be taken advantage of by those around them. And so these cases would sometimes come to our team, and Mary Joy often would also consult with our team, talk to us about situations where the only way we could really stop the abuse was to bring in the legal remedies. Yes. And often that was conservatorship, which is our term, as you mentioned, for adult guardianships. So that was really how I came into the undue influence world, was through my work through the Elder Abuse Prevention Network.
Right. And I read this incredible research document that Mary Quinn did, quote, for the Borchardt Foundation, on Undue Influence. Can you share what you know about that? And that's up on your website, elderjusticecal.org, if I'm remembering correctly.
Sure. Well, can I give you a little bit of a background story before that?
Definitely. Absolutely.
Well, what got us interested in Undue Influence was, again, through this multidisciplinary team that I facilitated and hosted. One day we had a prosecutor come to one of our meetings, Dennis Morris, and he was asking the group if anyone knew of an expert in brainwashing.
Mm.
And he went on to describe a situation that he was working on, a case that he was building involving an older woman who had been taken off to Reno, I believe it was, to get married to this much younger man. He
Hmm.
started telling us this story where she was kind of an eccentric woman, kind of isolated, estranged from her family, and she really was targeted by a group of younger opportunists who started moving in on her, both figuratively and literally. They um, moved into her home. They basically confined her to a small apartment in the basement or a small room somewhere in the basement. Started transferring her properties, her assets into their name, and convincing her to kind of go along with the program.
Mm-hmm.
And at the point that she was taken off to Reno, basically because she was realizing that people were onto what she was doing and that there were folks investigating. At that point, Dennis got the case, but really wasn't sure that he was going to be able to do much with it. He knew that there was wrongdoing,
Mm-hmm.
but the justice of the peace that married them would not really commit to saying that it was a case of fraud, that the woman was incapacitated and unable to, um, you know, legally offer consent. And so he really wanted to know if we knew somebody that kind of had an understanding of gaslighting and what he was calling brainwashing techniques.
Mm-hmm.
And so somebody in the group recommended, he actually, there was kind of a long silence, which was unusual with that group. Usually people had all kinds of suggestions and were pretty well connected group. But
Right.
somebody recommended Dr. Margaret Singer, who was an expert in cults. And
Yes.
actually, he started her career working with prisoners of war during the Korean War, working with people that had turned on their fellow prisoners. They're actually kind of showing signs of Stockholm Syndrome, where some of them actually aligned with their captors.
Yeah. I
Um,
know Margaret, by the way, and she wrote the foreword to my first book, Combating Cult Mind Control. So we go back a
right.
long ways. Go on.
Really groundbreaking work on her part.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. And so she agreed to serve as an expert witness in that case. And it was one of those things that once people started talking about it, she became really in demand. Everybody who was working elder abuse cases knew of a case where there was something funny going on, people being, talked into doing things that they wouldn't ordinarily do. And
Yes.
so there was just a lot of interest in it. So that case went on and made its way through the criminal justice system. Uh, Dennis credited her with really making his case through her
Mm.
testimony. Um, but the case also landed in the probate court. There was a conservatorship uh, petitioned for the older woman by another family member,
Mm-hmm.
and so the court got interested in this, and Mary Joy got interested in this, and she started. Seeing more and more cases coming to the court with allegations of undue influence, or where her investigators, she ran the probate court investigation unit,
Mm.
where court investigators were starting to suspect undue influence. So it
Mm-hmm.
became a real interest of hers, and she was able to get funding from the Borchard Foundation to take a deeper look at undue influence. And I was fortunate that she involved me in that study because it was the first study because it was really interesting. There were um, several studies that followed. And what she really had set out to do was to try to come up with a definition of undue influence
Mm.
for our statutes here in California. Because at that time, the court was operating under a definition that went back to the mid um, 1800s that talked about undue influence in terms that were pretty arcane, using language that was pretty outdated.
Right.
And so we kind of walked into this study trying to come up with a definition of undue influence. So we looked through their case studies of conservatorship that
Mm-hmm.
the San Francisco court was handling. We did focus groups with practitioners. We did a review of the literature, looking at how undue influence had been looked at in the legal community and in the psychology literature, and also in
Yeah.
the elder abuse literature. And we eventually came up with a definition of undue influence that was loosely based on the Soder um, model, which I believe you've written about, Steve.
I put it in my dissertation. It was, it's critical. I don't know that I can spell it out each letter off the top of my head, but the model, gets incorporated in my work through Shefflin that included the Soder model of look at the influencee, the influencer, and their status, their position, their motive, their techniques, how they execute it, and the consequences
Exactly.
of it. Mm-hmm.
Right. And that model was developed really specifically for will contests.
Mm.
And so we thought that it was a useful model, but that it didn't really cover all of the kinds of undue influence that we were seeing and that we were hearing about from colleagues in our field. And so what we did was really expand on it, where Soder talks about vulnerability based on cognitive impairment. We
Yeah.
broadened that to include the kinds of situations we were seeing in elder abuse. We knew that people were vulnerable if they were ill, if they were grieving, if they'd recently lost a loved one.
Exactly.
Um,
Situational vulnerabilities. Yep.
ex- and that could be cultivated by
Yes.
what Margaret Singer used to call manipulators, or
Mm-hmm.
she had a term not coming up with, artful manipulators, I think was her term.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then in the category of the influencer, of how people gain power, we brought in a lot of different ways that people exercise power on older people in undue influence cases. So, there are people that have power through legal means, who are their guardians or
Right.
um, agents under powers of attorney, those kinds of things. But we also know that people have power because they're in control as caregivers. If
Mm-hmm.
somebody is in control of what you have to eat and who you can visit with and those sorts of things, that gives you power.
Yeah.
We also see power by professionals. Some
Mm-hmm.
people take the uh, you know following doctors' orders literally,
Mm-hmm.
and believe that doctors have power that and should be believed even when it may not be to their benefit.
Right.
Um, we have safeguards, we have guardrails for that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Doctors, psychologists can't have relationships with their clients. Uh, Lawyers can't inherit from their clients. And
Right.
so we took kind of a broad look at who the influences were and how they exercise power over older people.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the area of affirmative actions that manipulators take to gain control, we also looked at some of the literature on um, the Stockholm Syndrome
Mm.
and the kinds of power that people exercise in domestic violence relationships. We looked at some case law that dealt with undue influence and that defined undue influence. And then under that last category of the unfair outcome, we included things like people gifting or selling property at that was really not in the case of a gift that wasn't really commensurate with the relationship or the
Right.
selling something at below market value, those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
And we also just looked at how people did things that didn't seem to reflect their personal values and beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that definition, that kind of four-tiered definition, eventually made it into California's updated law on undue influence that went into effect in 2014.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing and it's great. And you went on to develop the California Undue Influence screening tool that could be then taught to state officials who were investigating these cases as well.
Yeah, we actually developed the tool for adult protective service workers who are the
Mm-hmm.
kind of on the ground folks that come and investigate cases. And they're not necessarily the ones that are going to file for a conservatorship, but they make a lot of referrals to public guardians, in situations where they have a victim or alleged victim who doesn't really seem to have the capacity to take actions to protect themselves or um, uh, to get back property that's been misappropriated, that sort of thing. And so really what the tool does is it helps them organize their thinking about these four areas, knowing
Mm-hmm.
that these are the areas that the courts are directed to look at, these
Right.
four categories. And so it helps them organize their evidence that they present, for example, to a public guardian.
Right.
It's not a validated tool like the like MoCA or the other cognitive status tools where you give somebody a ranking or a score.
Mm.
We're not at the point where we have that kind of expertise or validation of the instrument. So it's really more of a way of presenting material and documenting it for the court or even for your files to
Mm-hmm.
if you want to move forward in time to see if influence is being generated over time.
Right. So, because I know Margaret Singer, she's passed away, unfortunately, wrote Cults in Our Midst and Crazy Therapies. She also was an expert in hypnosis, which is a tool that many destructive cult leaders use, and I'm seeing more and more use on people, including elderly people. But it seems like the law doesn't understand what it is, what it isn't, how it could be used ethically or unethically. And I know that Alan Shefflin, my former mentor, who also passed away, wrote a book called Trance on Trial about how, on the one hand, hypnotically refreshed memory was not accepted in courts of law, on the one hand, acknowledging it has power, but it's not something that could be pursued as a criminal
Mm.
technique used on people to subvert their will power and such. It's so fascinating. So if I may go back to the Borchardt report, I seem to remember my bite model being put in an appendix to that, which I was honored to be included. Um, and I seem to remember a clause added to that of what I think Margaret Singer called dependent adults. I'm not asking you to comment on it, but just for me, um, I can say back when I got deprogrammed, Lisa, from the Moonies in 1976, what was happening were parents were able, with the help of a judge, to get a 1 week conservatorship over their Mooney children, arguing, Your Honor, my adult child was a victim of artful and designing people. We would like custody to explain brainwashing and expose our son or daughter to former members who already left, who can reveal what's actually going on inside the group. And the judges were granting these, and sheriffs would go to the Mooney house and escort the person to a place where I would meet them. And it worked almost every single time because the power of the court order was a real, like, there must be something to this. And of course the judge wanted to see the Mooney back in the court the following week because these were ex parte conservatorships, meaning the judge granted it without meeting the cult member yet. But the cults freaked out because so many people were leaving with this approach that they decided they needed to join together forces, get the ACLU involved, get other religious groups involved, and lobby it out of existence. And since I think it was 76 or 77, it's been illegal to grant ex parte conservatorships when someone was involved with an authoritarian cult. And all I can say is I have law-abiding clients who know their loved one never would have become a sex, a prostitute, a trafficking victim, or under the control of a gypsy and doing slave labor. But the law can't do anything other than knock on the door and say, "Are you okay? Do you want to leave?" And the person says, "I'm fine, and I don't want to leave." And my families are like, "What can I do? There's nothing I can do legally, and I don't want to violate the law and abduct my loved one." So
Mhm.
for me, I'm fascinated and looking for ways to provide real human rights resolution to at least educate people about what is a cult, what is mind control, who is this person that you've committed your life to.
And
Um,
it's a tricky one because,
yeah.
especially in the field of elder abuse prevention, we're very sensitive about infantilizing people who are in weakened states.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a big part of what we do is to try to make sure that people's rights and wishes are respected. And so, taking measures, involuntary measures against people is something that we would, very rarely do unless it really
Right.
feel that it's in the name of protection and that there are not less restrictive alternatives that could be sought. But like I say,
1,000%.
when and conservatorship certainly has gotten a bad name,
Mm.
particularly in the last few years we've seen a lot of
Mm-hmm.
newspaper exposés and the Britney Spears movement.
Mm-hmm.
But when I came at this from the field of elder abuse prevention, we'd have meetings of people, discussing cases where somebody was being terribly exploited, or even physically abused, and
Mm.
the only remedy that was available was conservatorship. But again, we've always seen it as a last resort
Yes.
when other methods have been used and haven't been effective.
Yeah. I'm all for that. I just think that the law needs to be updated to what we know more about with social psychology and
Mhm.
neuroscience and hypnosis. And we are an aging society. And AARP, I think, is the largest single nonprofit in the country. And I guess I also wanted to ask you if I remember correctly, you saying that there are some politicians in Washington that are very interested in the Elder Justice Coalition and what you are learning and advocating. Is my memory correct?
We do the organization um, where uh, I helped found, the California
Yes,
Elder Justice Coalition. We mostly do advocacy in the state
I
of
see.
California. There is a national Elder Justice Coalition that has been working on federal legislation that worked on the Federal Elder Justice Act
I
that
see.
was passed in 2010 as part of the Affordable Care Act.
Mm.
But we also, we do sometimes get involved with national advocacy initiatives because what we do in California is oftentimes affected, by what's happening at the national level.
Yeah, and
So,
California is often cutting edge and does things before the rest of the country catches up on it. And I guess on a personal note, I'm thrilled that Kamala Harris is now the presidential choice for the Democratic Party. And I remember she was the Attorney General of California, I think, during the period of time where there was undue influence was brought up in terms of helping elder people. So I don't know. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we might be in the age of enlightenment where, since there's so many people who've been radicalized online to believe conspiracy theories and become part of psyops and other types of mind control cults online, that we can like do a psychoeducation approach for everybody, no matter what age you are, and that everybody doesn't walk around thinking it could never happen to me, but has a more humble attitude that it's happened to very smart people from good families with lots of education. And so let's inoculate everybody, kind of like from a mind control virus point of view.
And that was one thing I learned from Margaret Singer. I also got to know her well. She's a fascinating woman.
Mm-hmm.
Lots and lots of stories. But one of the points that she often made is that anybody can be unduly influenced. It really was just a matter of the strength and the perseverance and the techniques used by the manipulator. So it wasn't just something that involved people who were in vulnerable states.
Yep. And I'll just say, as a former member, when I met her, and Robert Lifton was another giant who was studying Chinese communist brainwashing and such, it was such a breath of fresh air to hear a professional say, I'm not defective. It could happen to anybody who is lied to under a set of situational contextual variables. Phil Zimbardo is another person who's been a big supporter of my work and very conscious, and even taught a course at Stanford, the psychology of mind control, for 15 years at Stanford. But it's I never would believe it's possible if it hadn't happened for me, to me, myself personally, dropping out of college, quitting my job, turning my back on my family, on believing democracy was satanic and that we need to infiltrate the government and take it over. The things that are happening in 2024 is stuff that I got indoctrinated with 50 years ago now. And so it's a journey for sure.
It's
Um,
been really interesting in talking to colleagues in the elder abuse network. When I've lectured on undue influence and just talked to people informally, everybody knows about situations that fit the pattern.
mhm.
And it's really interesting. I was really fortunate as part of one of the Borchardt studies to do a literature review on the psychological literature and the legal literature on undue influence.
Mhm.
And but as I talked to people, they would bring up, gee, this sounds a lot like the Stockholm Syndrome, or this sounds like what cults do, or,
Mm.
they recognize these, the parallels with other types of exploitation, and everybody seems to have a case or knowledge about it. So what I did in part of the research was just kind of follow some of those strands. And I know
Mm.
you and I have both looked at the work of that was done in advertising, which was
Mhm.
not
Edward
um,
Bernays.
uh, right. And there was another
He wrote a
author.
book called Propaganda in 1928. He talked about he was Freud's nephew or some relative, and he said, "You don't sell the product; you sell the need for the product." Yeah.
But even when it wasn't being used in a, uh nefarious way,
Mm-hmm.
um, that there are just as humans, we are influenced by social pressures and how people
Yep.
can manipulate those kinds of tendencies that all of us have. to believe that uh, that somebody who's good looking is probably
Robert Cialdini's work.
yes,
That's
yes,
right. So social proof and liking and law of
right.
reciprocity.
That attractive people are
Yeah.
more righteous or kind or generous, and
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, social psychology is ultimately fascinating, and they always do deceptive studies in order to reveal human nature. So Ash conformity study, or the Milgram obedience study, or the Zimbardo prison study. Um, and I believe Milgram and Zimbardo was deemed unethical, so they created internal review boards because they felt like it was too much for human subjects, that they needed
mhm.
to have checks and balances. But I literally just did an interview about this cult in Kenya, where over 400 bodies have been exhumed because the members of this church were following their prophet's orders, who said the end times are here, don't eat or don't drink water. And people died. And now he's on trial, and the country of Kenya is looking at the victims of the cult as criminals because they want to kill themselves. It's against the law to kill yourself in Kenya, and they don't have any understanding of brainwashing. And so again, it's easy to say, oh, look at what happened there, but Jonestown was a phenomenon. The People's Temple came out of San Francisco, I believe, at least early in their genesis. And over 900 people, including Congressman Ryan and Jackie Spear. Congresswoman Spear was shot on the tarmac by this cult. um, so your organization is so vital, and yet I can tell you, I just recently heard from a prosecutor in Florida whose grandmother has been told that he's evil because his father has a medical condition, and they've convinced his grandmother not to talk with him. And he contacted me, and I sympathized. Of course, he said, we and there are mandated reporters who should report when bad activities are happening, but they're not bringing him cases against individuals who are doing this. So, but he wants to do stuff together, and I said, great. And then I said, do you happen to know Lisa Nerenberg? Elder Justice, California. So I gave him the website URL. I'm sure he'll be in
Sure.
touch.
A lot of what we do in advocacy at the state and national level really comes from the field. It's people that are, dealing with with cases on a day-to-day basis, that come through the mental health system or the legal system or the criminal justice
Mm-hmm.
system. And, you it's one thing to deal with individual cases, and then you start realizing that there are patterns of conduct and patterns of responses and different
Mm-hmm.
needs. And so a big part of what we've tried to do is bring that expertise from the field, bring, human experiences to groups where we can kind of flesh out, is this a pattern? Is this something that is an advocacy issue? Do we need to address this through law or through training? Um, and so, really, a lot of what we do, and we started what we call the A team, which is a multidisciplinary team, and the field of elder abuse has lots of elder abuse multidisciplinary teams. We have them in different settings, forensics teams and financial abuse teams.
Mm-hmm.
But our A team is specifically focusing on advocacy. And so we take these problems that come to us from local teams and from local individuals and try to really flesh out is this something that is a bigger issue that needs to be addressed through policy at the state level or at the national level? And so
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of this organic way of coming up with policy recommendations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, case examples are incredibly important. Um, and are you coming across the interface of computers and AI being applied to elder people? Because I've heard you can like get 3 seconds of someone's voice, and then that your grandchild's voice can be
Well,
played.
exactly. And we were
Mm.
seeing, we talk about grandparent scams. I mean, there are all kinds of different scams, but that one was, where somebody would get a phone call. I actually got one of these recently.
Mm.
Somebody calls and says, "Hey, Grandma," and they expect you to say, "Is that you, Jimmy?" "Yes, it's Jimmy."
Mm.
Um, but that was just being done by, kind of guessing
Yeah,
on the part of the
human.
perpetrators. But now, I fear to think about what could be done with AI generated voices and images, and we're also seeing a lot of computer uh,
Phishing
facilitated
attacks and
crimes. Yeah.
hmm yep. And a lot of people of our generation don't know that much about computer techie things and how to turn off sharing personal information or how to protect your information online. Uh,
Well, and another thing is, we've seen robotics, revolutionize caregiving.
mm,
But the idea that you have access to a person in their homes, uh, you know, in their personal business,
right.
it can be very frightening.
Yeah, that and surveillance, the surveillance piece
Yeah,
as
what
well.
is your robo dog really finding out about you, and who's he working for?
So, I've learned that your phone your microphone can be picking up your conversations and transmitting it without your permission or knowledge. And I recently resubscribed to a product called deleteme.com. I was advised to use it, and they search the dark web for your phone number, your home address, all the things that are used to dox people who are speaking out on particular topics. It's not 100%, but at least it's an effort to clean out your personal data, so the average person at least can't get access to it. So, what is your hope? I know you're working on conservatorship research, another book. What? Tell us a little bit more about what you're finding and what you kind of an ideal hope for situation in that regard.
Sure. So I've written a couple of books, which thank you for pitching.
Sure.
Thanks for the references. And they've been directed really for colleagues in the professional world, people that are
Mm-hmm.
working in the field of elder abuse prevention or aging more broadly.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've been finding in my life, my personal life with friends and families, they're starting to talk a lot like my colleagues in the field.
Mm.
All of them seem to be involved in caregiving for family members or, um, you know, dealing with their own issues about aging. And so I find myself, talking at family meals, at family reunions about my work more and
Mm.
more, where it
Mm.
used to be, oh, you you were out there
Right.
doing that kind of work. Now it's much more relevant to their lives.
Yep.
So what I'm trying to do with the book that I'm working on now is to really speak to a general audience
Mm.
for specifically for those of us that are facing aging issues ourselves or with family members, and really anybody that that aspires to become old and live a long and healthy life. So
Right.
it's a little bit of a different focus, and bringing a little bit more of the personal side of myself into my work.
Yeah, that's exciting. So I guess I want to just come back to the how do we protect people's right to privacy and their decision maybe not to leave some property to their own children, or leave more to one or the other, versus where someone has been isolated and estranged and taken over? How to suss out some of those important variables?
Well, I think, one of the things that we talk a lot about in order to preserve your rights, if, in the future you become unable to monitor your own affairs effectively, working, we've been promoting the use of advanced directives, and
Mm,
not just things like wills, but, really thinking through, um, you know, h- how you what is your legacy and what you want that to be, and also, not just after you die, but what how you want to be cared for in the event that you can't make decisions for yourselves.
mhm,
And so I think, we used to think of estate planning as being something only for wealthy people,
mm,
but CEJC, the California Elder Justice Coalition, has been really trying to promote the idea of doing advanced planning for people, for all people. Um, and really using it as an opportunity. One of the things I've been excited about is thinking about how families can use estate planning as a way to convey their values to future
yes.
generations. It's not just a matter of, who gets what,
Yeah.
but what our family values are that we want to help preserve for future generations.
Hmm.
Um, and I think we also, in our country, in our culture, we put off advanced planning until late in life when people are really at their most, likely to be at their most
Right.
vulnerable. And I think having some of those conversations earlier in life is important.
Yeah, absolutely. And recording it,
Hmm. Hmm.
and I've been telling my clients, especially, the cult clients where they're estranged, do a video message to your loved one should anything happen to you that not only conveys your values, but your love for them, and basically begging them to take a time out from their group, and that there's money set aside for them to learn about mind control and to reevaluate, because they may decide they want to change course, and it would really make them feel very good to know that they have the ability to do that.
And
um,
I think that's a great point of having it recorded because I think, sometimes when we're trying to, what we think of influencing people in the right way
mm,
doesn't always register um, at one point in time. But we think about, there are oftentimes these moments of opportunity when
yeah,
somebody is more open to other ideas and, um, maybe receptive to a family member who they've shut out in the past because, somebody has led them to distrust that person.
yeah. And if they're in a cult, not just writing them out of the will, and but again, designating a person, an objective person who could oversee a potential process where the person could get access to the resources should they decide they want to leave, and don't want to just stay there because they have no other option.
One of the topics that's gotten a lot of play lately is supported decision making,
Hmm.
which is more of an informal way of helping people make decisions. And, for those of us that are really interested in preserving autonomy, it's something that offers, that's hopeful. Um, and yet we don't really understand. We don't know enough about it. It's being used much more with in the disability rights community with younger people with
Hmm.
intellectual or cognitive disabilities, and we don't know really how well it works with older people.
Hmm.
Um, but I think there have been different. I've been hearing about different. supported decision-making techniques where you even bring in kind of like a almost a team approach
Right.
to having people talk about their wishes and their values, and so that when they're being helped, when they're helping somebody with decision making, it's not just one person who can exercise influence, but it's people that it's kind of a broader based network of support.
Yeah, that makes sense. A lot of sense to me, and in many ways, it takes the pressure off of one person, especially
Mm.
if they're talking about quality of life, or if they're going to hospice, or so. May I ask you about the movement to give choice to people who are in great pain and there's no hope of a cure, who want to take their life? I believe Oregon has now made it legal. Do you have share any thoughts about that? Love to hear you.
It's obviously a very controversial issue.
Yeah,
In my book, I talk about the different levels of capacity that we use to to try to understand the different kinds of decisions that make in people's lives. Clearly, it looking at those kinds of ends of life decisions are very controversial. I think many of us believe that, that's one of the most personal decisions there is, and it belongs with that person.
right.
And yet, I know that there are there are many people that worry that that can be that somehow that can be exploited,
Hmm.
or that people can be, unduly influenced
Hmm.
into, ending their lives um, for reasons are that are unrelated to their personal values and choice.
Right. Yeah, it's an ultimate choice or an ultimate act, I should say, depending on things. Me personally, I if I'm like dysfunctional and I'm not able to think and it's just costing money and my loved ones are worrying about, just warehousing my body, I'd rather check out personally. With so that's my decision that I, put into my
And yet,
documents.
as somebody who's an expert in mind control, don't
Yep,
you have concerns about how that could be manipulated?
sure.
Mhm.
Sure, but I don't know. I guess I trust my family, and I'm more worried about being a vegetable and a burden. I'm worried about somebody offing me. Kind of feel like anyone can off me at any moment because I'm so public and writing the cult of Trump and everything else, that I've just lived with it as a given and enjoyed my life each day at a time.
Well, I think at least we're making some progress on being able to talk about this. I mean, if you
Mm,
remember, when Obamacare was passed, and people were taking that and running with it, and you know, generating fear about the idea of death panels. If doctors were talking about end of life decisions, or end of
hmm.
life quality of quality of care, quality of life, that they were somehow um, you know uh, you know, the term death squad, which was used to
Yeah.
describe, just discussions with physicians about medical decisions.
Yeah, and it's probably the same people are for capital punishment, which I am opposed to, that kind of hypocrisy and such. Um, but it's such important work that you do. I'm very grateful. I'm wondering, is there a story that comes to mind, whether a story with Margaret Singer or a case that you found particularly fascinating that we can move towards the end of our interview with, that will make people think about things? I'm just fishing
Well,
for
I've been out in the
something.
field for a while from
Okay.
taking cases directly, but just going back to the that first case that that generated so much attention and that
Mm-hmm.
ended up really changing our laws in California.
Mm-hmm.
It was just it was such a it was a it was a disturbing to hear how greed had caused people to, take advantage of an older woman. It also was, ended up having a lot of positive impacts in the development of policy. And so that was a very interesting case. And there have been others like it. Oftentimes it's the, people who are wealthy,
Mm,
or celebrities, and when they're abused, those cases come to light.
mm.
Um,
Yeah, or to have an attorney that sees an injustice and, uses their network to reach out and say, "Hey, do you know anyone who can help us?" And then an expert stepping up and going, "Actually, yes, I think I can help." And I'm just excited, personally, because I've been doing this work for 48 years since my own deprogramming. I'm personally so gratified so many former members are becoming mental health professionals
mhm.
and wanting to help others to get out and recover from being in these authoritarian extremist groups and such. So I'm thrilled about that. And likewise, there's much more attention now to gaslighting, to something called coercive control, which the UK has passed as a law, largely about gender violence and control, man over woman, but not only. And so, from different angles, uh, abuse of power and control are coming together, and hopefully into a tapestry of in the law that we can then have a coherent model that makes sense for people. That's why I did my dissertation, and I'm happy to say the bite model is scientifically validated now as a construct and being used in labor and sex trafficking. So we're doing more research. I'm developing an online research tool for people to self-diagnose, as well as to create a database on specific organizations. So that's what
Well, we
I'm
should
up
maybe
to.
talk more about how you validate an instrument like our Undue Influence tool.
Yeah. So in my case, I just took my bite model and I created a Likert scale of never to always, and made all of the qualities of behavior, information, thought, all it going in the same direction. And we had lots of people filling it out about from different groups, healthy groups and
Mhm.
unhealthy groups. And the unhealthy groups, there was a very high factor analysis for control. And so, and it was one factor: control, behavior control, information, thought, and emotional control. And I'm part of a forensic think tank at Harvard Medical School, and some of the psychiatrists were saying, undue influence has already been defined. You're trying to redefine it. You can't do that. And then someone said, why don't you create a new term? And then you get to define it. So I made the term authoritarian control as opposed to undue influence.
So
So
who owns the term undue influence?
no, it's everyone has undue influence, that
But you said
term,
somebody else has.
but authority, yeah. So no, I mean it's the psychiatrist was arguing that it's been British common law for 300 years, and it has to do with property,
Mm.
the ability to turn over property,
Mhm.
and that I can't use it to
Yeah, that
describe
has been around for a
taking
long
over
time. Yeah.
somebody's mind and their thoughts and their language system and all of that. So, I did the bite model of authoritarian control, and if you are controlling these four overlapping elements, then you're taking over somebody. So that's what I'm working on. Lisa Nerenberg, thank you so much. You are an elder justice warrior helping protect all of us, and especially us over 70 uh, and older, and just bringing light to this very important topic. I thank you so much for being a guest on the Influence
Well,
Continuum.
thank you. It's been a pleasure, Steve.
Yeah, my pleasure too. Thanks. Steve Hassan here. You know, it's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the super thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind, only you should control it.